think we should get started, right? Everyone is in the room. So let me see. Let's give one more minute. Some people are trying to log in and so. So I think we should get started. So welcome everyone to IfAD, the Initiative for Agency and Development Economic Workshop. And today, as you can see, our topic is what we are going to be talking about is women, business, and the law. Before we get started, I wanted to just few logistical issues. How we will go about it is that each panel will get their time. As you saw the program, they will talk, they will have a presentation and which will be centered around women, business, and the law. And then each discussant will have their response and their own perspective. Following that, we will leave the question answer session for the end. And just to ask question, please don't use the chat feature. It will be distracting. Instead, you raise your hand using the feature and I will call your name and you can directly ask the panelist your question. With that said, I'm really thrilled to have all of you today. We have a wonderful panel and I can't be happier that we are going to end IfAD event of Spring 2022 with this workshop. So just to give a broader context, why it is important and significance of topic and discussion that we are going to have, I was going to give you a little bit some context. One is, of course, some sense of why we are talking about gender equality and women per se. So what is the extent of gender gap? Then obviously for the particularly last 70, 80 years, there has been significant progress in our understanding of why gender gap persists over time. The third issue is why it matters. Why gender equality matters, and if it matters, what is the policy landscape? And in that context, why issues of women in the context of business and law is important. So here is the picture. This is the income gap. This is the data from World Economic Forum, and this is for 2021. You can see this is aggregate picture for the world as a world. For average income for man is $23,000 today. For women, approximately half of that, which is $13,000. So that is income gap. If you look at political participation, only 26% of senators, congressmen, member of parliament, and legislative assembly, only 26% of those congressmen and representatives are women. And keep in mind, women account for more than 51% population of the world. On the other hand, when it comes to governance, only 23% of political leaders who are making decisions around the world are women. If you look at overall picture, that this is also from World Economic Forum. When you look at the dimension of economy, politics, and education, what you will see is that if there was a perfect equality in this picture, you will see that this line square will be equal. So you can see if it was 0, it coincided, there will be perfect equality. A line which is bold, that shows the ratio of women's achievement compared to men. So as you can see, even today, in terms of education, women are very much close to man. The gender inequality in terms of education is the lowest. When it comes to health, almost we have closed the gap. But those education gap, the progress in closing the gap in education and health has not translated into closing the gap in economy and politics. This is for 2015. So one thing you would be wondering, to what extent this gender gap is persistent over time. Here, without going into details, this is showing from 2006 to 2021, and the line which I want you to look at is the dotted line. This is the extent of gender gap. So basically, women have in 2006, women had only 65% of what men had. And there has been a steady progress. But if the current rate of progress continues, according to World Economic Forum's estimate, it will take 135 years from now to close the gap, to have some kind of parity. Now that is global. I wanted to just bring it, let's look at India. So this is a picture, which is in India, many of you may know that we had the tradition, this is where we began. This is a picture, an illustration of Sati Pratha. And what was Sati Pratha? What this picture is showing is that if a husband died in ancient India, woman used to self-immolate herself. Basically, she used to also burn on the pyre of the husband. Now, in Indian historical literature, ancient literature, this is a very controversial and emotive discussion. Some people would argue that this is the worst form of gender discrimination and disadvantage a person, an individual can conceive of. On the other hand, in some text, there has been argument that this shows utmost devotion of women and sacrifice. But that is where we began in India. Where we are today, this graph, what it shows, that in every age group, the life expectancy of female compared to life expectancy of male. This red line is 45-degree line. And these are different states of India. Most of the states, with the exception of 2 states, Bihar and Jharkhand, they are above the 45-degree line. What it means, in every age group, one's life expectancy, even in India today, is much higher than man. Keep that fact in mind, that if you look at this picture I was showing you, this was the status of a woman when we began. In our culture, Indian culture, the most revered gods are women. Also, India is the second country in the world to have a woman prime minister, head of the government, that began in 1966. So the question, all these pictures, what it highlights is that 2 things. The gender gap remains significant and it has remained persistent for over centuries. And strong regional cultural dimension to it. So it is not a surprise that over the last 70, 80 years, there has been significant progress in trying to understand it. And the range of explanation differs. It starts from gender differences in human capital, ability, work, all these explanations, to here we are talking about agency. So these are possible explanations. So we have a very good understanding of why gender inequality has persisted and what it explains it. But still we do not know sufficient enough. Now the question is, what is way forward? The one way I think about way forward, I will skip this, is the following. In order to reduce gender inequality, close the gap, the public policy options are twofold. One is we can have policy level intervention. We can make markets work for women better. That is one. So we can create equal playing field. Another kind of intervention is that given that women have been historically disadvantaged, discriminated, just making market work for them in principle on the book may not do the job. So what we need simultaneously is we need agency level intervention. And that is come up with programs and policies that empower women to compete in the market. So these are two paradigms through which we can think of gender empowerment programs. It is in this context, what we are going to talk about today, today's discussion, is role of law and limits of it. And what is interesting about it, role of law is in both cases. If you make laws more gender equitable, it will make market work better for women. On other hand, there is a huge amount of, in fact, increasing body of literature, interdisciplinary, that shows laws play a very important role in building or limiting an individual's agency, especially women. So it is in this context, I am really happy that we are having this discussion, and where our focus will be about the role of law and the limit. And in that context, the World Bank's Women and Business and Law, this report, this is the annual report that World Bank has been publishing since 2019. It measures the differences on access to economic opportunities between men and women in around approximately 119 countries. And since that, it has really become one of the most sought after reports internationally. And it is hugely debated. And it has actually brought the issues of gender inequality at the forefront of international policy discourse. So today we have around this, we have amazing panel, 5 panelists today, and we will start with World Bank team, Women, Business and the Law, and I will introduce them today and they will talk, and then after that we will go about it. So our speakers are from the World Bank, Alena Sakhonchik. Alena is a private sector specialist at the World Bank, and her current research focuses on regulatory and policy gaps around affordability, availability, and quality of childcare. And this is one of the focus of the report that we will be discussing today. Prior to joining World Bank, Alena worked for Center for Strategic and International Studies, Hudson Institute, PBN Company, one of the leading international strategic communication firms, specializing in Russia, Ukraine, and broader post-Soviet space. She has a master's in international economic relations from American University. Alena will start, she will talk for about 20 minutes, and then her colleague, Marie Hyland, she will be also talking, they will be presenting together. So Marie is an economist at the World Bank. She joined the team, Women, Business and Law team in 2019, but she has been at the World Bank since 2016. Marie's work, current work focuses on economic impacts of economic reforming gender discriminatory laws. And she has been working with one of my most favorite economists, Penny Goldberg, who was until recently chief economist of the World Bank. So she has a very interesting line of work. Marie also has worked on economics of water scarcity, private sector development, and gender. She has a PhD from Trinity College Dublin, and she is a former Fulbright scholar. With that, I welcome Alena and Marie to give start the conversation, and they will talk about Women, Business and the Law report. So with that, Alena and Marie, welcome. The stage is yours now. And
thank you very much, Tauhid. Thank you very much. It's really an honor to be here and learn from all of you, as well as share the work that we're doing and maybe find some areas for the discussion, how we can improve each other's lines of work when it comes to achieving gender equality worldwide. So let me give you, the screen is not shared. I'll just real quick project the presentation. Share the screen. Okay. All right. So let me just briefly walk you through the agenda for today's presentation. It will roughly consist of two parts. In the first part of this presentation, I will give you a little bit of a background about Women, Business, and the Law project, and I will highlight some of the key findings from the edition of the report that came out on March 1st, 2022. I'll also briefly touch upon some of the new areas that Women, Business, and the Law have been exploring over the past year. That's access to available, affordable, and quality childcare services, as well as the legal environment in practice. So we've been exploring the measurements of the enforcement and implementation. And later on in the second half of this presentation, I'll pass it on to my colleague, Hyland, who will debrief you on some of the research that she's been doing with Women, Business, and the Law and the metrics of women's economic empowerment. So over more than a decade, our team has been trying to investigate one question: how do laws affect women's economic opportunities and their lives in general? So around this topic, we have been consistently dedicated to improving our products and delivering publications that are data-driven, evidence-based, and that can also be used to inform policy dialogues and development projects across a number of countries. In 2019 study, we came up with a new way of looking at our data with the introduction of Women, Business, and the Law legal index and the 8 new indicators that are structured around women's interactions with the law as they begin, progress, and also end their careers. In 2022, we also introduced a 50-year panel data set and started exploring some of the reform trends starting since 1970s. In the first update of the data on an annual basis happened with the publication of the report in 2021 edition. And in 2022 edition, we have also introduced 2 new areas of research around implementation and enforcement of laws, as well as the assessment of regulatory frameworks on available, affordable, and quality childcare services. So up to date, our research roughly focuses on 190 economies worldwide, spanning 7 regions. And we also rely on the contributions of more than 10,000 legal experts around the world that help us collect the data and inform our analysis. So when we started, let me just give you a little bit of the background about how we came up with the measure of how we came up with the WBL legal index. When we started thinking about the construction of this metric, and it happened between 2018 and 2019, there were a number of factors that we put in the thought process. And the main ones were the choice of indicators based on the life cycle approach of a woman that typically before 2019 study, Women, Business, and the Law covered a wide range of indicators. It was more than 45 questions, or we also call them data points that were part of the data set. So the choice of indicators was one of the primary factors that we were considered. The second factor was the criteria that determines the inclusion and exclusion of laws that can potentially go in the WBL index. And the third one was also the intuitive weighting scheme for creating the overall index. Apart from these factors, when we were thinking about the creation of the index, there were a number of questions that we wanted this index to address. For example, how are women's employment and entrepreneurship opportunities affected by legal gender discrimination? And in turn, how does that affect economic outcomes, such as women participation in the labor market? We also wanted to see what is the size of the legal gender gap and how quickly it is closing over time, and what progress has there been within and across regions over the years. And eventually, when we came up with the 50-year panel data set, we also started exploring how do reforms happen on the ground. So the WBL index today, as you know, it measures explicit discrimination in the law, the absence or presence of legal rights, as well as the provision of certain benefits. The index is comprised of 8 indicators that track discriminatory laws that affect women's lives at every stage, from mobility to joining the labor market, having kids, and eventually retiring. There are a total of 35 questions that are scored across 8 indicators that are composed of 4 to 5 binary questions. And each indicator represents a different phase of a woman's working life. And the 8 indicators, as you can see in the slide, are mobility, workplace, pay, marriage, parenthood, entrepreneurship, assets, as well as pension. Indicator level scores are obtained by calculating the unweighted average of responses to the questions within that indicator and scaling up the result to 100. Then the overall legal index score is calculated by taking the unweighted average of the 8 indicator level scores and scaling up the result to 100, which represents the highest possible score. So questions included in the indicators were chosen based on a few criteria. So the first one is the existing empirical evidence from the economic literature. The second one is the statistically significant associations that we also employed to test the questions and the data points against women's economic empowerment outcomes, such as employment, business ownership, and as well as the extensive round of consultations that we held throughout the whole process. Indicator choice is also supported by the internationally agreed standards, such as the UN Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women and the ILO conventions. So today, the goal of this metric is to allow data users to see how laws affect women's prospects as employees and entrepreneurs in a given economy, with the hope of inspiring legal reform. So as I have mentioned, looking at the literature was one of the main criteria that we have explored. So we employed a thorough review of existing empirical evidence, and that the body of which is growing and stresses the importance of laws in shaping women's economic outcomes across different domains of each selected indicator. So the review of the literature demonstrates how legislation influences women's equality of opportunity during different phases of her working life. So the evidence today also suggests that there are significant negative consequences of legal gender discrimination on women's outcomes. However, there is also considerable variation in the depth of the literature across different domains. A significant share of the evidence for certain domains today is drawn from the developed countries. However, this raises questions of the relevance and applicability of this type of evidence in the developing country context. So the literature also highlights some potential unintended consequences of well-intended policy interventions to address legal gender discrimination. And the bottom line is that research also has called into question the notion that economic growth alone increases gender equality. Rather, continuing policy commitments to gender equality are required to achieve it. So in the latest edition of Women, Business and the Law report that was published on March 1st, 2022, we find that the global average Women, Business and the Law legal index score is 76.5 out of 100, which indicates that a typical woman has just 3/4 of the legal rights afforded to men in the 8 areas measured. So this leaves us roughly with 2.4 billion women of working age all over the world that are still not afforded equal economic opportunities in comparison with men. For example, in 95 countries out of 190 covered, women are not guaranteed equal pay for work of equal value. In 46 countries, women are not protected against sexual harassment in the workplace. 86 countries also impose at least one legal restrictions on women's employment, while 30 countries do not have laws protecting women from domestic violence. So inequalities like this, if you think about them, they largely also contribute to the earnings gap that Tauhid was mentioning earlier in his opening remarks. And actually, one of the recent World Bank studies also finds that closing this gap, that the earnings, that the wage gap, could potentially add 172 trillion US dollars to the world's economy, which is an equivalent of 2 times the annual global GDP. So these numbers are actually striking and make a pressing case for achieving gender equality worldwide. So in this year's edition, we also now have roughly 12 countries that score 100. All are high-income countries, with Greece and Spain joining the group this year, which previously also included Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Ireland, Latvia, Luxembourg, Portugal, and also Sweden. So that also means that in 178 economies out of 190 covered, which is close to 95% of the global country coverage sample, room to reform these legal barriers and enhance women's economic opportunities remain. So if we look a little bit closer at the regional picture, what we see is that there is a lot of work left to be done to advance gender equality agenda. The highest and lowest scoring regions remain the same as in the previous publication, with the economies in the OECD high income region, Europe and Central Asia, as well as Latin America and the Caribbean, scoring above the global average. So far, the 2 regions that are furthest behind are the Middle East and North Africa and South Asia, and followed by Sub-Saharan Africa and East Asia and Pacific. However, if you also look at this graph, you will see that scores within each of those regions diverge significantly, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa and in Sub-Saharan Africa, with the difference between the highest and the lowest scores ranging between 62.5 and 60 points respectively in these 2 regions. The smallest difference of 21.2 points between the highest and lowest scores is in the OECD high income region, which also has the narrowest dispersion of scores across economies. So every region has examples of economies whose governments are implementing good practice laws and those that still have room to improve. But countries can definitely look up to their neighbors for examples when seeking to implement reforms or inspire others to do so. While progress has been made, the pace of reforms must be accelerated as well. When we take a closer look at the indicator level results, the mobility, workplace, marriage, entrepreneurship, and assets indicators have an average global score above 80, which means that the most economies have removed restrictions or introduced the relevant legal rights and protection measured by these indicators. Average score, conversely, average scores are lower for the pay, parenthood, and pension indicators. For example, in the pay indicator, we find that in 86 economies worldwide, women still face some form of a legal job restriction. Women cannot work the same night hours as men in 22 economies. They also cannot work an industrial job in 69 economies, nor in jobs deemed dangerous or arduous in 53 economies. So restrictions such as these ones typically make it also harder for women to gain employment in many high-paying jobs in high-paying sectors that could include transport, manufacturing, construction, water, energy, or even mining. So some of the sectors that for some countries may be more competitive than others. But even when they can have the same jobs as men, they are also still underpaid. So half of the economies, roughly 95 out of 190, still do not mandate equal remuneration for work of equal value in line with the principles of the ILO Convention number 100. And only 50 out of 190 economies have paid parental leave policies where parents can also share the burden of care after childbirth. Parenthood indicator has an average score of 55.6 and has the most room to improve, followed by the pay indicator. 19 economies score 0 on the parenthood indicator, which is a pretty substantial number, meaning that they do not have any of the good practices measured by this indicator. Neither they have leave available for mothers of at least 14 weeks in line with the ILO standard, which is fully administered by the government, nor they have the leave available for fathers or parental leave, and the prohibition of dismissal of pregnant women is absent from regulatory frameworks. However, gradually we're making progress. This has been a difficult time for any country to reform over the past 2 years. And yet, despite the pandemic, we identified that 23 countries across all regions in the world enacted 39 reforms to increase gender equality in 2021. Many of the new laws are in the areas that actually needed the most and are aimed at providing more benefits to working parents and also improving conditions for women in the workplace. Most reforms were implemented by the Middle East and North Africa, as well as Sub-Saharan Africa, so the regions furthest behind, as I mentioned before. The Middle East and North Africa also advanced the most as the result of reform efforts, with roughly 25% of all economies covered in a region implementing at least one reform. Economies in Europe and Central Asia also passed reforms, despite the fact that they have the average score above the average score above the global average. So despite that, 17% of economies within a region change at least one law to improve gender equality. And additionally, many reforms have been conducted in Western and Central Africa. The highlight of this report's edition is Gabon. Gabon stands out because it undertook comprehensive reforms to its civil code and enacted the law to eliminate violence against women, which roughly affected 9 of the 15 questions or data points covered, for which the country previously was recorded a no. And that affected the scores across 5 indicators for Gabon: mobility, workplace, marriage, entrepreneurship, and assets. And finally, the parenthood indicator, with positive changes in 8 data points across 8 countries, also recorded the highest number of reforms, followed by the workplace and pay indicator. So we must continue to explore the critical relationship between women's rights and economic outcomes and further build the case for gender equality in all areas of life. So this year, Women, Business and the Law is doing just that by expanding its research to critical areas of childcare and the implementation of the law. COVID-19 crisis, as we all experience over more than 2 years at this stage, has amplified the importance of aligning childcare policies with the needs of working parents, and particularly the needs of working mothers, as they were bearing the brunt of responsibilities for childcare during the pandemic. Oftentimes, dozens of women end up leaving their jobs to be able to provide care, unpaid care within a household. So taking care of children should not be treated as women's issue, and it's essential for providing available, affordable, and quality childcare services is also essential for building inclusive societies. Our pilot research on childcare in 95 countries measures legal frameworks around availability, around 3 main pillars: the pillar of availability, affordability, and quality of childcare services. And while the environment of childcare varies greatly across countries, it is clear that this must be a priority going forward to achieve better outcomes for women, children, as well as the economy as a whole. Over the last couple of years, Women, Business and the Law team have also received substantial feedback on the work that we have been doing, all pinpointing to the fact that beyond having good laws on the book, the absence of the proper implementation and enforcement of such laws can also be a critical barrier to achieving gender equality. So we don't want just to see a law on equal pay for work of equal value. What we want to see is that women actually do receive equal pay for work of equal value. So gaps between laws on the books and the actual practice restrict the full realization of women's rights and opportunities all over the world. So to address this issue and to present a fuller picture of the legal environment for women, this year's edition has introduced a new conceptual framework for measuring implementation gap. So the pilot exercise was conducted for 25 countries worldwide that examined both the supportive frameworks for primary legislation to create an enabling environment for working women, as well as expert opinions of progress that has been made towards gender equality of individuals on the ground. So when we talk about the supportive frameworks, what we mean is actually when after the law is passed, what needs to happen next? how can rights be effectively enforced? How can benefits be provided? And how can we measure the barriers to women's economic, how we can make sure that barriers to women's economic inclusion have been removed in practice as well. So in other words, under the supportive framework, we're capturing the existence of policy instruments designed to support the implementation of rights. And what we found in these 25 pilot economies is that on average, these pilot economies have only half of the supportive frameworks for adequate implementation, which indicates that a gap between the passage of laws and their implementation is substantial. And while these results are still preliminary and we have a lot of work to do to develop this exercise a bit better, and we would definitely welcome your feedback around the approach that we have undertaken, yet these preliminary findings are already confirmation that laws alone are not enough to improve gender equality. So our goal right now is to continue exploring this area and improving the approach we have undertaken so we can have more robust results in the years to come. And on that note, please let me pass it on to my colleague Marie, who will briefly update you as well on some of the research that's been undertaken with women, business, and the law metrics.
Great. Thank you very much, Alena. Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, apologies for the technical issue there for a moment. Alena and I are in the same room, so we were trying to figure out how to mute her and unmute me so there wasn't an echo. So thank you very much, Alena, for handing over to me, and thanks everyone for joining today. It's a pleasure to be here and to have an opportunity to speak with you all and to present the Women, Business and the Law project. So Alena has given an excellent overview of the Women, Business and the Law Index, the data and some of the important findings from our most recent report, as well as the areas that we're currently developing. I'd like to take some time to talk to you about the research that we've undertaken thus far with the Women, Business and the Law data. In particular, I'm going to focus on 3 research papers that we've carried out using the data. So the first one, Gendered Laws of Women in the Workforce, introduced the Women, Business and the Law data set. It provided a description of the methodology and introduction of the data, and it also highlighted some key stylized facts from the 50 years of panel data that have been collected to date. In a subsequent follow-up paper entitled Gendered Laws Matter for Women's Economic Empowerment, we looked at the correlation between the Women, Business and the Law Index and various metrics of women's empowerment. And we also asked what country characteristics were significant predictors of a country's score in the Women, Business and the Law data. And then the third paper that I'm going to present today is a little bit different in that it takes the perspective of firms. It uses microdata and it looks at the relationship between the Women, Business and the Law Index and the informal origins of firms in the private sector and then their subsequent performance. So I'm going to present these 3 papers, and then I'm just going to take a moment just to highlight some areas that we're currently working on, and then to flag some empirical questions that we think could really do with more research, more analysis and more data. So with that, I'll start with the first paper. So the Gendered Laws of Women in the Workforce paper. So what this paper did was it offered a global picture of discrimination under the law and its evolution over 5 decades. as I mentioned previously, it presented the index and the methodology. It did this in academic form for the first time, and it gave what we think was the first kind of global overview of gender discriminatory laws and their evolution over time. And we highlighted 5 key facts from this analysis. The first is that a woman in the average country has 3/4 the rights of a man, that women are most severely penalized when it comes to laws that are related to having children and to getting paid. We also found that over the last 5 decades, we've seen tremendous progress, but that the pace of reform has differed significantly across regions. And that not only has the pace of reform differed across countries and regions, but also across the individual indicators that are captured in the Women, Business and the Law Index. And then finally, we highlighted that legal gender equality is positively correlated with women's outcomes in the labour market. As Alena has already touched on the first two topics here, I'm just going to focus on the stylized facts 3 through 5. And go into them in a little bit more detail with you now. Okay, so as I said, the 5 decades have seen tremendous progress, but the pace of reform has been notably different between regions. When we look at the evolution of the index across regions and over time, there are some interesting comparisons that jump out from the data. So one is if you look at the relative evolution of the Women, Business and the Law Index in the Europe and Central Asia region, so what we refer to as the ECA region, relative to economies that are in the OECD high income grouping. So in the 1970s, women in Europe and Central Asia actually faced fewer restrictions than their counterparts in high income OECD economies, but the evolution of the index in these 2 regions has been very different over time. And there was significant progress made in high-income OECD economies from around the mid to late 1970s through to the 1980s, and that has continued over time. Another interesting comparison is between economies that are in the Latin America and the Caribbean region, so the LAC region, and the East Asia Pacific region, EAP. So in the 1970s, the average scores in these regions were very close, but economies in the Latin America region made much more progress over time, particularly you can see it in the 1980s. And what we found in our research is that these economies were kind of motivated by the push to reform that happened in European countries, and they followed suit, whereas the gap then widened between the economies in this region versus the East Asia Pacific region. In the 1970s, if we compare, or if we look at the relative scores for countries in South Asia relative to sub-Saharan Africa, we can see that there were much fewer restrictions in South Asia compared to sub-Saharan Africa, but much more progress was made in sub-Saharan Africa over time, and today the difference I believe is about 8 points. So the regional average in South Asia is 8 points higher than the regional average in sub-Saharan Africa is about 8 points higher than South Asia. So there's been a notable divergence in how the progress that economies have made, and also when this progress was made. It's been highly non-linear, and there's some very interesting comparison of the data. The other region that's perhaps worth flagging is the Middle East and North Africa region. So you can see that the progress in this region was very low, or very slow, pardon me, for the particularly the first 2.5 decades covered by the data. So the regional average score for economies in the Middle East and North Africa increased by only about 4 points between 1970 and 1994. So in the first 25 years covered by the data. But then in the subsequent 25 years, the increase was closer to 15 points. There was much more progress later on in the data. And this graph goes up until 2020. So this was as of the time the paper was published. But if you take the last 2 years of data, we see that the average score in the region has increased by another 4 points, which is really striking when you think that the average progress in the past 2 years has been equivalent to the first 25 years that we cover in the data. So it's been interesting to see the relative evolution across regions. An alternative way of charting progress in the index is to count the number of changes made. So as Alena highlighted in her presentation, the Women, Business and the Law Index is made up of 35 individual data points. So what we do in this graph is we sum the number of positive changes across all data points in a single year to look at the global progress or the global pace of reform. And when we chart reform in this way, we can see that the peak year of reform is 2008. This, it turns out, was driven by reforms in sub-Saharan Africa. And in general, the period from the mid to late 2000s was a period of significant reform in sub-Saharan African economies. And an important driver of this reform was the adoption by the African Union of the Maputo Protocol, which guaranteed a wide range of rights and equalities to women. And it's no surprise that we can see this very strongly in the Women, Business and the Law data, because of the 35 data points that the Women, Business and the Law covers, 30 of them are covered under the Maputo Protocol. So we can really see the influence of this treaty in this graph. There's been other important international conferences and conventions that have made important pushes towards equality, as we captured in our data. So the CEDAW Convention in the late 1970s, 1979, the UN Conference on Women in the mid 1990s also had an important push to economies to reform their gender discriminatory laws. There's been other drivers also. So we've seen the important impact of bilateral and multilateral organizations. So for example, the Millennium Challenge Corporation worked with the government of Lesotho to help them reform discriminatory laws that limited a women's economic autonomy. Also, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development worked with the government in Kazakhstan to lift job-related restrictions that were in place on women. And there's also been many country-specific factors that really are very dependent on the culture in the economy and the economic factors that were happening at that time. So the next highlights fact that we highlight in the paper is that the pace of reform varies not only across countries, but also across individual indicators. So here we've presented a graph with the scores unweighted and then weighted by a country's share in the global population. So we see that the workplace indicator displays the fastest pace of reform, both when the scores are unweighted and when they're weighted by population. And that this indicator has started from a relatively low base. We also see that the mobility and assets indicators display the slowest pace of reform, but they start from a relatively high base. So there was maybe less room to move in these areas. We find that the pay indicator also displays a slow pace of reform, and that's despite the fact it starts from a relatively low base. So there's still a lot of room for improvement there. And another thing that's interesting to note in this data is that we actually see a drop in the global average of the pension indicator when the reforms are weighted by population. So you don't see this in panel A, but you can see it, the green line in panel B shows this drop. And what actually happened here was a negative reform to happen to the pensions indicator in China in 2008, I believe it was, whereby there was a mandatory retirement age introduced that was different between men and women. So I think it's just interesting to highlight the fact that, one reform in an economy, if a large economy, can have, an impact that's very important for a very large number of women. You can really see it on the global scale. The fact that the reform has differed across indicators suggests that there's different, different degree of motivation for economies to reform these laws. It's perhaps not surprising that the workplace indicator has seen a lot of reform, in that this may be economies' efforts to integrate more women into the workforce during a time where the demand for labor has been rising. So there was economic motivations there that seem to have pushed countries to reform in these areas. So the final area, the final stylized facts in this paper that I would like to highlight is that we find that legal gender equality is positively correlated with women's outcomes in the labour market, as measured by the labour force participation rate and a reduction in the gender wage gap. So these are just showing the high level correlations between the index. We're not suggesting there's any causality here, but we do think it's important to note that the regressions capture year fixed effects, but also unobserved factors at the country level. So we're estimating these relationships or these correlations based on changes within countries over time, so rather than on cross-country variation. So this is suggestive, at least, that where countries reform gender discriminatory laws, women do see better outcomes in the labour market. And then following on from this, we show that these positive correlations extend beyond labour supply and the wage gap. So in a subsequent paper, we looked at correlations across a wide number of metrics of women's economic empowerment, and we found that the positive correlations that we showed in the first paper continued to be visible in other outcomes. So the first outcome that we look at is the gender gap in outcomes. So this is data from the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Index that Tauhid mentioned earlier in his introductory remarks. So we're using the aggregate score here. So this looks at the progress that's been made at closing gender gaps across economic participation and opportunity, educational attainment, health and survival, and political empowerment. And that we find that including year fixed effects, country fixed effects, and income in our regressions, we see this positive correlation between a reduction in gender gap and outcomes when the legal playing field between men and women becomes more equal. Another high level metric of women's economic empowerment that we look at is the relative proportion of women in positions of vulnerable employment. So vulnerable employment captures two categories of workers. So it's the self-employed without any employees, and also unpaid family workers. So these workers are considered vulnerable in that they are least likely to be to have the access to protection to social safety nets. They're least likely to be in a position to save, and therefore they're extremely vulnerable to any adverse economic shocks. And again, we find that an improvement in the legal playing field between men and women reduces the likelihood that women in an economy are in positions of vulnerable employment. The magnitude of the relationship declines a lot once we account for unobserved factors at the country level, but it remains significant and robust in all specifications. And then the third metric that we look at of women's empowerment is women's representation in Parliament. So these data are from the Interparliamentary Union. And we think it's an important outcome to consider, because women's political representation, of course, is an important matter for democracy and for human rights, but also it's been shown that that having a greater representation of women in politics is associated with more laws being passed that relate to sexual harassment, to rape, and to domestic violence. So it has important impacts for women more broadly. And again, we find a positive and robust correlation between improvements in the Women, Business and the Law Index and women's representation in Parliament. So these are just three findings from the paper, but we look at a much wider range of outcomes, and we find that this positive and significant correlation holds across a wide range of measures of women's economic empowerment. In this paper, we also consider what country characteristics predict reform. So, and we find that there are several country characteristics that are strongly and significantly associated with legal equality as measured by the Women, Business and the Law Index. So these are the results from a single regression where the dependent variable is the Women, Business and the Law Index. And we also could include controls for the time fixed effects, and real GDP are also in these regressions. And we look at the correlation, first of all, between geography and women's economic empowerment. This is motivated by the area of the literature that looks at the correlation between economic development and geography. And we find that many of these factors are significant predictors of legal equality. We also find that religion, legal origin are significant predictors of legal equality. And then also so polity, so the degree of democracy in an economy, and the durability or the stability of the political regime are important predictors of gender equality. And what's interesting from this is that these characteristics together account for about 70% of the variation in the women, business and the law index. This is despite the fact that we don't have, country fixed effects included in the regression. So it's interesting to see that, the characteristics that are correlated with legal equality are either those that seem to be those that are either fixed, so such as, geography or legal origin, these don't change over time, or that evolve very slowly, such as, the predominant religion or the polity in an economy, which suggests that that changing these laws is something that will happen in the medium or the longer term. Despite this, as we've shown in the data, reform does happen, but it's perhaps unsurprising that it can be slow, kind of sticky in certain regions, and that it doesn't necessarily happen in a linear fashion. Okay, so then turning to a more recent paper that we've carried out using the data. So this is work that's been co-authored with Asif Islam, who's also at the World Bank. And here we've moved away from using the country level data and correlations, and we're looking at the correlation between legal equality and firm level outcomes. So we explore whether discriminatory laws affect the choice of a female entrepreneur to start a business in the formal versus the informal sector. And we do this by merging data from the enterprise surveys with data from the Women, Business and the Law Index. The enterprise surveys, I don't know if any of you are familiar with them, but they're a World Bank data source that measure the formal private sector in an economy. So when we're talking about informal origins here, we're looking at the informal origins of firms that later formalized. So it's a very particular type of informality that we're looking at. And what we find is that more equality between men and women lowers the probability that a firm with a female owner will begin operating in the informal sector. But this is not true for firms that are fully owned by men. And then we also find that regardless of the gender composition of the owners, firms that began informally are subsequently less productive. So these informal origins do seem to have a longer run scar on the productivity of firms. So this graph just shows the coverage of economies in the data set, and also the large variation in the prevalence of informal origins across countries in the data. So it ranges from about, I think, approximately 1/3 of the firms surveyed had informal origins in some economies, and fewer than 1% in others. So what do we find? We find that for firms with female participation in ownership, where the women, business and the law score was higher when the firm began operating, the firm was less likely to begin operating in the informal sector. We find this relationship is significant after we control for factors at the economy level and also for other firm level characteristics that might be predictive of informal origins. We find that when we look at the relationship for firms that have no female owners, the relationship disappears. So there's no significant positive effect for firms that don't have female owners. We also disaggregate the results by region. So as I showed previously, there's been notable differences in how reform has happened across regions and indicators. So we thought it might be interesting to look at whether or not the correlation between legal equality and these informal origins differs by region. And we find that our overall results are driven by firms in 3 specific regions. So in Sub-Saharan Africa, in the Middle East and North Africa, and in South Asia. And these are important findings because these are regions where informality is quite prevalent, and also regions where historically there's been high levels of legal discrimination against women. And then I guess the final thing to highlight from this paper is you might ask, does this matter? We're looking at a very specific subset of informal firms that later formalized. So does it matter? And we find that it does, that these having these informal origins seems to have a permanent scarring effect on the firm's productivity. So subsequently they are less productive. But interestingly, for the most part, we don't find any significant difference of the scarring effect on male versus female owned firms. So there's lots more research underway using the data, but I just maybe would like to highlight some of the empirical questions that remain. So we would, really like to learn a lot more about the interplay between laws and norms and how reforms in the WB index might be exerting a positive impact on the evolution of social norms, or vice versa, how norms might be driving reforms in the laws. More research would also be extremely valuable, establishing a causal link between legal reform and outcomes. And then also, we're covering a very specific type of worker here, and that we're, our laws or our index assumes that we're looking at a worker who's employed in the formal sector. But it would be interesting to ask to what extent the discrimination under our index also captures discrimination that's faced by workers in the informal sector. And this research is becoming, all the more important given the recent economic crisis that we faced, and how women have been so adversely impacted in terms of their participation in full-time employment, and the negative impact that the COVID crisis has had on the gender gap, and increases in occurrences and reportings of gender-based violence. So we would really call for governments to prioritize reforming remaining gender discriminatory laws as they're looking at the reforms and the policies that will take us out of the COVID-19 pandemic. For more information, we really welcome you to go to our website and to take a look at the data and some of the country studies that we have there. It's wbl.worldbank.org. And just to thank our partners for their support in our research and our work, from USAID, from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and from the Hewlett-Packard Foundation. Thank you.
So thank you, Alena and Mary, wonderful presentation. It is just really, really insightful, very detailed, and I'm sure it will generate a lot of discussion. With that, actually, now I welcome Amy Jerrett from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. In addition to international effort and international effort by different countries and development institutions, I can't think of any other organization than Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that has been at forefront of women's empowerment program around the world. So I'm very glad that Amy can join us today. So Amy Jerrett is a program officer at Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She joined the foundation in 2012. And prior to that, she worked at the Institute for Competitive Force at United States Chamber of Commerce. Amy has bachelor's in international relations from International Research Institute, Institute of Technology, and master's international affairs from Catholic University of America. So Amy, please take 10 minutes or so to respond to what Alena and Mary presented. And also if you can share some of your own work, particularly at the foundation, that is complementary to this effort. So welcome, Amy.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here today. As mentioned, I've had the fortune of working with the Women Business and Law team for quite a while. I've been at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for about a decade. Before working on advocacy and communications on our gender equality division at the Gates Foundation, I worked on and led our women's financial inclusion portfolio, and had the pleasure of being around as the Women Business and Law team did a deeper dive into the gaps, the legal and regulatory gaps for women's financial inclusion, which of course is a critical component to understanding how we move forward on gender equality. So I'm really excited to be here today, both to applaud the amazing work that the Women Business and Law team have conducted, but also to give a little bit more, maybe the other side of things, the perspective of what do we do next with these findings, this really robust amount of information that's coming out. How do we actually see change then occur from that? And that is an area that I'm deeply passionate about, and why I'm working on advocacy and communications at the foundation. So I've been asked today to talk about why this investment is so important to our strategy and our work, and then how it fits into some of our other investments, and maybe speak a bit to the implementation and the policy and funding change that we seek to see as a result. So I wanted to start off by just telling you a little bit about a TED Talk that I listened to by comedian Lily Singh. I'm not sure if folks have come across her, but I highly recommend her TED Talk. It's a little cheeky and edgy, but it is fabulous. And I think it really sets the stage for the conversation here about why women getting a seat at the table isn't enough to drive gender equality. And I think this really reckons back to the point of gender equality is not just legal reforms, nor is it just agency. It must be a combination. It's a complex, diverse set of change that needs to happen. So in this TED Talk, Lily says that sustainable, impactful change roots much deeper than a seat at the table, because there's an invisible gatekeeper called culture, and that table is smack dab in the middle of it. She then goes on to describe the inequities that exist create a wobbly chair in this metaphor. And she says the crazy thing about being on a wobbly seat is that you spend so much time trying to keep it upright that you can never bring your full self to the table. This rang true for me, as I imagine it does for a lot of the other gender advocates in this virtual room, as well as any other woman who has tried to progress in her family, in her community, workplace, and has felt less than. This also resonated in that change, as I said, requires a multifaceted approach, one that's led and rooted in the cultural and social realities and needs of the country, and is rooted in an approach that focuses on addressing social norms that are holding back that progress by amplifying local voices and stories, engaging with existing movements, and overall pushing for a shift in the prioritization and valuing of women. Legal and regulatory barriers are both a strong indicator of how women are valued within an economy, as well as a helpful compass for countries to determine where to focus on driving change. So maybe a little bit more about the Gates Foundation strategy and why we find this report to be so important. Oh,
yeah.
Oh, is someone trying to jump in? Nope. Okay, great. So the Gates Foundation has been committed to addressing the unique needs of women and girls since its inception. But it was in 2016 that we made our first commitment to focus on gender equality. And I am absolutely thrilled to say we are about a year and a half into our very own gender equality division that is focused on gender equality, but is also focused on infusing gender equality across the issue areas at the foundation. Along this journey, we, together with input from partners, grantees, experts from around the world, I'm sure several of you on this call for sure, have developed a theory of change that identified a discrete set of compounding barriers that women face around the world. And in that, we found that there are barriers that women and girls face that differ, including by socioeconomic status. And these create compounding barriers, which suggested to us that we needed a multi-tiered approach. As such, we shaped our strategy and thus our funding to focus on, number one, strengthen positive social norms around women and girls. So really understanding what the gender roles are and understanding how to shift them within cultural sensitivities. Number two, expand women's leadership, especially more women in leadership positions in influential health institutions. Number three, increase women's economic opportunity and decision-making power, which I think certainly rings true and comes through very clearly within the Women, Business and Law report and how critical that is. So for example, one way that we are pushing on that is by ensuring more women have access to credit. Number four is improve women and girls' health. So in other words, one way that we're pushing on that is through seeking fewer women with anemia and more women with access to contraceptives. So in this work, we take pride in funding some of the most impactful advocates and programs, including this incredible Women Business and Law team, as well as others in this virtual room, including UN Women and others. These groups are working to ensure women and girls in Africa and South Asia can enjoy good health, make their own choices, earn their own money, and be leaders in their societies. So our ultimate goal is for women and their families to lead their lives with agency and to know that they are fully valued by their communities. Despite the great leaps that the world has made to improve global health and alleviate poverty, women and girls continue to face unique structural, legal, social barriers that hold them back from equally experiencing and contributing to these gains, as we have discussed already today. And this report plays a really critical role in identifying some of those. I mean, 100 economies, it's legally acceptable to pay women less for equally valued work. 38 economies, a woman can be fired for being pregnant. 140 economies don't mandate paid parental leave. These findings and more highlight a societal undervaluing of women and girls that is shocking and unacceptable. What's more, restricting the full participation of half the population is not only just unjust, it's also poor economics. COVID has added in an additional layer, as we talked about, in most cases, further regressing progress towards equality. In the first year of the pandemic, women were nearly 2 times more likely to lose their jobs. By the end of 2021, men largely regained their pre-pandemic employment, but women's employment failed to bounce back. During the pandemic, women's unpaid care burden increased, which I think many in this virtual room can attest to. I certainly experienced that, and many have not returned to the labor market. This impacts women's autonomy, their families, communities, and also how they're viewed within their communities. According to the 2022 SDG Gender Index compiled by Equal Measures 2030, another grantee, overall progress on gender equality across the SDGs has been too slow, too fragile, too fragmented, and the impact of COVID-19 has exacerbated these inequalities, threatening to reverse these fragile gains. Research published last month in The Lancet provided the first global evidence on gender disparities across a range of social and economic indicators. Notably, the proportion of women worldwide who stopped work to care for someone rose by 10%. The highest rate of income loss were seen in sub-Saharan Africa. So as world leaders and funders rebuild from COVID, we face a really critical moment to set the course on a trajectory of progress, one that values women and girls and shapes policies that reflect the normative behavior change and valuing we strive to see and that we need. But how do we take these important insights and translate them into action? As I said, this is an area I'm deeply passionate about, and as a result, this is where I sit within the Foundation on Advocacy and Communications. I can't tell you that we have this completely figured out, but I can tell you that what I have learned is the strength of evidence really lies in the access and the use of that information by the precise people we wish to influence. So how can we convince those in power that progress hinges on gender equality and that women and girls matter? As such, a proportion of our work in the Gender Equality Division focuses on investing in strong and resilient civil society to help increase their resources and influence, pushing for greater resourcing and policy change in support of women's economic empowerment and women's leadership, supporting platforms that drive progress to improve data and accountability on gender equality, supporting positive gender norms, and raising the Foundation's voice where appropriate and additive to galvanize action. To do this, together with our partners, we work on identifying and leveraging effective narratives, emerging evidence, compelling spokespeople, influencers, identifying key moments to support gender equality sector efforts towards mobilizing evidence at the right time to the right people with the right message. One example of this is through an investment that we made with Nation Media Group, which is one of the largest media outlets in Kenya. The newsroom had an interest and an appetite to both report more on gender equality, as well as weave gender intentionally through their news stories. But the newsroom needed some extra financial support, as well as some technical guidance to kickstart this work. So through a partnership with the Fuller Project, which is an expert group of journalists who specialize in gender reporting, Nation Media brought in a designated gender desk. So someone on staff along with that is focused in on gender, along with a data specialist to help support the translation of new data and new insights, such as this report, into consumable content for the readers that is also socially and nationally relevant. This combination has resulted in an impressive transformation in Kenyan media and discourse on gender equality. Not only is there an increase in evidence-rich gender equality-related stories, but there is excitement, appetite, and interest in learning more and mobilizing change. In fact, some of the preliminary findings have already tracked a sharp increase in mention of women in leadership in the Kenyan media during COVID, a preliminary indicator of a shift in dialogue and perception. And if you're tracking Kenyan politics, now is a particularly exciting time to see an increase in reporting on women in leadership. We have also been grateful for the leadership of UN Women and the many advocates around the world who have mobilized commitments at the Generation Equality Forum. We are passionate to support this team's effort to drive accountability towards those ambitious commitments. And lastly, I would love to just highlight one other example of how we think about connecting evidence and new information to change. We know a primary stakeholder in influencing funding decisions and policy change are those in power in donor countries as well as multilaterals. So given the outlet foreign policies reach and influence, we funded them to produce a podcast. And I know I have a visceral reaction when someone says, I just created a new podcast, because it usually only reaches a small group, very niche. I get a little nervous about it, but I will tell you that this has been one of the most exciting projects to work on, because foreign policy has this really uncanny ability to tailor information for the exact audiences that we're trying to reach. And so through this podcast called The Hidden Economics of Remarkable Women, available on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts, but they created this podcast series that is focused on elevating the voices and stories of women around the world who are driving forward progress on gender equality. And I'm happy to report that several episodes have greatly benefited from the voices and the findings of the Women Business and the Law team. Including a focus on the wonderful, amazing work that happened in South Africa related to the marital laws. So we've been impressed with this series. It's trended on iTunes. It trended in the Apple Store. I mean, across all podcasts. So the fact that this is gaining visibility, traction, interest is really exciting, but we've also already seen donor governments picking up the content from the podcast and using it within their work. This work and so much more is developed and led by brilliant minds of our partners and our grantees all over the world. And I'm very privileged to help elevate and create a platform to highlight this important work so that we can see the change we wish to see in the world. When women and girls have an equal chance to thrive and lead, everyone benefits. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy, for wonderful presentation, and it added the new dimensions that WBL has been able to do. With that, this is now I invite Zohra Khan from UN Women, and as I mentioned that among international institutions, in addition to World Bank, UN Women in particular has been the spearheading the discussions and discourse on the issues of gender around the world. So Zohra Khan is UN Women's Senior Policy Advisor on governance. She leads UN Women's work on gender budgeting financing for gender equality, which is really important. In this role, she has provided technical assistance to around 80 countries around the world. She has over 20 years experience on gender equality and development in international and non-governmental organizations. Prior to joining UN Women, she was senior policy advisor at One World Action, where she worked on the impact of UK and European Union aid and trade agreements on women's livelihood. More personally, I am a serious student of all the work that comes out of Zohra's office, and I'm a huge fan. So thank you, Zohra. With that, I welcome you, and please share your thoughts and feedback.
Great. Thank you very much, Tauhid, for welcoming us so warmly into this forum. And I must say, even though I have dealt with women business and the law before in terms of using the database for my own work, I learned so much today. So thank you so much to Alena and Marie for really quite an excellent presentation and laying out, what an important kind of global asset this database is for the world. So just very quickly, because I know we want to open up for lots more discussion from everyone in the room. UN Women uses this database in two very important ways. And the first is really looking at the SDGs, because UN Women, as part of the UN system, we are custodians of many of the gender indicators in the Sustainable Development Goal Monitoring Framework. And one of those is, of course, indicator 511, which looks at whether or not legal frameworks are in place to promote, enforce, monitor equality and non-discrimination on the basis of sex. So we work with the World Bank and with the OECD using both Women Business and the Law and the SIGI Index to come up with a comprehensive assessment of where the world is in terms of reaching this particular target of the SDG. So it's very, very important for us. The other way we use it is really to drive reform on the ground. We have a operational presence. So UN Women is present across the world, as is the World Bank. And for us, eliminating discriminatory laws is in fact one of our key strategic areas in which we work. So very, very important for us. The Secretary General himself has made this a priority in his recently released Our Common Agenda. So, for us at UN Women, it's really all hands on deck in terms of how we can use this data, but also to make sure that we're supporting countries on the ground, working with legal reform commissions and so on, to make sure that they're able to replace discriminatory laws with progressive laws that really advance gender equality and women's rights, not just in the economic sphere, but across all dimensions, because I think it's very, very important to have a holistic notion of what we need to do in terms of the women realizing their rights. And really pleased, Alena and Marie, to learn about some of the work you're doing around the intersections between laws and social norms. I think that's a critically important area, and one that's often neglected. And Amy from the Gates Foundation also talked about culture being a huge barrier to women realizing their rights, and that we've known as economists, feminist economists, we've been saying that for 20, 30, 40 years now. So it's great that it's in the mainstream of public debate and public discourse, and that national governments are taking it up in their policy measures, they're designing policies that look at issues around social norms, culture, tradition, and so on. But what I wanted to share with you today was a bit of my own work that I do at UN Women and lead on gender responsive budgeting. And this is also part of the SDG monitoring framework. It's indicator 5C1. And the reason I wanted to share it with you all today is really because looking or having in place laws and policies that advance gender equality and women's empowerment is just one step towards the realization of rights. And we know this, it requires much more. But a very, very important factor in the realization of rights is around financing and resourcing. And we've done some work at UN Women. We've been working on gender responsive budgeting for a number of years. Our predecessor organization, which was called UNIFEM, that many of you are probably very familiar with, worked on gender budgeting and introduced gender budgeting in the 1990s. So like your historical analysis, Alena and Marie, which was so fascinating, we share that same kind of historical analysis at UN Women, where we're looking at how our work on gender responsive budgeting has evolved over the years, where, when we started, UN Women would only work with national women's machineries and with women's civil society, because these were natural, counterparts to us. But now we're working much more with ministries of finance, ministries of economy, ministries of planning, working in partnership with the IMF, the World Bank, and so on, because we see how central these ministries are to defining public policy and then allocating the resources needed to implement those policies. So that's been a big shift for us, and something that's heavily embedded in our new strategic plan, where financing for gender equality is seen as a systemic outcome, as is laws. So advancing laws and policies for gender equality, looking at financing, looking at what data we need, looking at shifting social norms, and then finally access to resources and services for women. So these are, very much all pieces of a very complex puzzle, and we need to get all of that right if we are to fully realize the ambitions of the 2030 agenda. So I'll just share very quickly, if I may, a presentation, please just give me a second, that we've just put together. Share screen, okay.
To share.
Okay, can you see it now?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, sorry, it takes a minute, doesn't it? Slide show. Okay, hope you can all see that now. And this is the gender responsive budgeting indicator 5C1. And what's really important about this particular indicator is that it measures target 5C of the Sustainable Development Framework, which calls on member states to adopt and strengthen sound policies and enforceable legislation for the promotion of gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls at all levels. And then the indicator that measures progress towards this target is the indicator I've just mentioned, which looks at proportion of countries with systems to track and make public allocations for gender equality and women's empowerment. And this indicator is incredibly important because it is the only indicator in the entire SDG monitoring framework, which has over 200 indicators, that links budgeting or resourcing with the implementation of laws and policies for gender equality and women's empowerment. So we've never had that certainly not in the MDG framework, but we've never had that in a monitoring framework before, where countries really need to think about how are they resourcing the laws and policies that they are adopting and implementing in their countries. And I think words like sound policies, enforceable legislation are incredibly important to drive countries to be ensuring that they are actually implementing these great policies and laws that they are putting in place. So how do we collect data on this indicator? So to assess if a country has a system to track and make public allocations for gender equality and women's empowerment, we use a questionnaire. So we administer a questionnaire that measures 3 main criteria. The first criteria is criteria 1, which looks at the policy framework and sufficiency of resource allocations for gender equality and women's empowerment. The first criteria, and I'll go into more detail on what these criteria entail, but the second criteria, just the headline, looks at the PFM system, the public finance management system. So it looks at whether there is in place a system to track allocations for gender equality and women's empowerment. And the third criteria, which is really around accountability and transparency of data, it looks at whether these allocations for gender equality are made publicly available. So can the public go out and access this and understand and know exactly how much money is being allocated for gender equality by their governments? So the first criteria has 3 questions, and it looks at which of the following aspects of public expenditure are reflected in your government programs and resource allocations. And there are 3 sub-questions to that. Are there policies and or programs of the government designed to address well-identified gender equality goals, including those where gender equality is not the primary objective, such as public services, social protection and infrastructure, but where they incorporate actions to close gender gaps? And this question was particularly important for us because we wanted to get to those massive programs where there is a lot of government financing, a lot of government funding, but where the immediate gender impacts might not be so obvious. So it's quite easy to look at a maternal mortality program or a program on girls' education and say, well, you know, this is what we're doing on gender equality. But it's really in the energy programs and programs like transportation and so on, where the gender gaps are not that easily identifiable. So we're trying to get countries to think, you know, where are the gender gaps in society? And that's where a database like Women, Business and Law becomes incredibly useful for us. So where are these gaps and are there resources being allocated? And the second question specifically looks to whether the policies and programs have adequate resources allocated within the budget, sufficient to meet their general objectives. So their general objectives in terms of what they might be in terms of, you know, energy or transport, and then their specific gender equality goals. And then thirdly, are there procedures in place to ensure that the resources are allocated, are executed according to the budget? And that's an important question for reasons of accountability. The second criteria looks at the PFM system itself. And so it asks, to what extent does the PFM system promote gender-related or gender-responsive goals? So looking at the entire PFM system, from the kind of budget approval stage all the way to budget execution stage, we ask the questions, does the Ministry of Finance or Budget Office, in some countries it's called a budget office, issue called circulars or other directives that provide specific guidance on gender responsive budget allocations? In some countries, they also have fiscal laws. So they have, for example, Morocco has an organic budget law that spells out how it intends to promote gender equality through the budget. That's an incredibly important mechanism. Are there key policies and programs that are proposed for inclusion in the budget? And are these subject to an ex-ante gender impact assessment? So do we identify and look at what the current situation of women and girls are in the country in terms of a particular gender gap that a policy or program is trying to address? Are sex disaggregated stats and data used across key policies and programs in a way which can inform budget-related decisions? Does the government provide, in the context of a budget, a clear statement of gender-related objectives? And this could be a gender budget statement or specific budget legislation. Are budgetary allocations subject to tagging, including by functional classifiers? So is there a way in the system that we can actually go in and look at where the gender expenditure is or the gender allocation is? And this is to identify how they link to the gender equality objectives that are spelled out in the policy of the program. Are they subject to an ex post gender impact assessment? So are we looking after implementation as to whether we've achieved those gender equality objectives or not? And then finally, is the budget as a whole subject to an independent audit to assess the extent to which it promotes gender responsive policies? So that's incredibly important for accountability. The third criteria is around data transparency. And it looks at whether allocations for gender equality and women's empowerment are made public in the last completed fiscal year. All of this data looks at the last completed fiscal year. So is the data on gender equality published? If published, has the information on gender equality been made public in an accessible manner on the Ministry of Finance or whichever other government office is responsible for the budget, on its website, or any related official bulletins or public notices? And this could be via, you know, radio or television, as we've seen in many countries where they actually give out a budget speech. And if published, has the information been made public in a timely manner? Because oftentimes in our work, we find that information is in fact not available on time, and the public receives this information well past the decision-making process. So that makes it incredibly difficult to actually influence decision-making on the budget. And so how do we go about classifying countries? For us, this was an incredibly important process because we didn't want to put countries in a situation where they felt that they were somehow failing and not doing well. So we tried to come up with a classification that encourages countries who are doing well to continue doing well, but encourages those who are perhaps not doing as well to continue strengthening their system over time. So if a country meets all three criteria, obviously then they fully meet the requirements. But then we wanted to include a classification around approaching requirements. So this would mean that countries might not have all the three or reach all three criteria or fully meet all three criteria, but they could have maybe 2 out of 3 or 1 out of 3. In some countries, there could be a phenomenal policy, legislative framework, agenda budgeting, but they might not just have, the tools in order to advance the work in the PFM cycle, and therefore they aren't able to make it public. In some countries, they might have maybe not that good policies, but a really strong PFM system that allows them to capture a lot of information. And so we really wanted to make sure that countries in this kind of big category of approaching requirements, which is where most countries in the world fall, are encouraged to improve their systems and not be discouraged that they don't fully meet the requirements. And then, of course, we have countries that don't meet any of the criteria, and so they do not approach the requirements at all. The next slide. So, how do we come up with our global aggregate? So our method of computation is quite simple. It looks at the number of countries that fully meet requirements times 100 over a total number of reporting countries. Our regional aggregates are calculated by the UN Stats Division regions, and they use the same computation method with regional data and numbers. So what does it look like in 2022? Well, here we are. As you can see, when we look at the global stats, we find that only 26% of countries globally, and we have 105 countries reporting in the 2018-19 to 2022 round. So just to kind of make that quite clear, so out of 105 countries, we have 26% of those that meet the requirements, 59% of those that approach the requirements, and 15% that do not reach the requirements. And these are the breakdowns by the regions as per the UN system classification. So we've got Sub-Saharan Africa, which broadly mirrors the global figures. Oceania, of course, excluding Australia and New Zealand, North Africa and Western Asia. Latin America and the Caribbean is really interested because we have 80% in that big kind of catch-all of approaching requirements. So that's quite high. The same with Europe and North America. And we've got East Asia and Central Eastern Asia also mirroring the global aggregates, and then Central Asia and Southern Asia, which has a significant amount, that 63% that's meeting the requirements. So they're doing particularly well. The next slide is, and this is the crux of the work that we do at UN Women, so critically important for us. It's looking at the gender responsive budgeting cycle and what are we finding under the GRB piece, because we know that under criteria 1 that looks at the policies that governments have in general, governments seem to have fairly good policies on gender equality and women's empowerment across the world, but really they're failing in execution. And we feel that much of that has to do with the fact that they just don't allocate sufficient funding or resources in order to implement some of those very aspirational policies. So we've looked in detail at the second criteria, and we found that 54% of these countries that reported have guidelines in place, 42% are doing an ex-ante GIA, 57% have disaggregated data, 38% have gender statements, 26% are doing gender tagging quite well, 39% do ex-post GIAs, and 23% do gender audits. So from the perspective of UN Women, this then would give us a clear steer to where we need to strengthen our programming and do more things. So certainly around issues around auditing needs some attention. So we currently thinking about how we can progress the work on gender audits, and certainly work on gender statements. So supporting countries and really being clear around what they want to achieve in terms of their gender equality goals that really flow from the policies. and which leads me to my last slide, which is we will be documenting and sharing some promising practices as part of our global knowledge generation on GRB. So that's forthcoming, and you can find that on our website. And we want to put in a lot of effort on expanding the database in 2022, 2023. We did put in a lot of effort in 2020 and 2021 to expand our database, but COVID and other things got in the way. And as many of you know, governments were really struggling with having to think about not just how to deal with COVID on the health front, but also how to deal with the economic collapse, really, of many economies across the world. So that work was put on pause a little bit, but it picked up at the end of last year, and we're now just presenting this new data in 2022. We also want to do much more outreach and capacity development. So looking at some of the regions, sub-regions with the largest gaps, identifying why some countries are not reporting. This is an SDG indicator. It is in the framework, governments have agreed to it, but still we have some, in fact, large numbers of countries not reporting on the SDGs. So what are some of the issues? What are some of the problems that we can help unblock for countries? What are the bottlenecks? And of course, we continue to provide on-demand capacity support and strengthening to countries. And we do this very much in collaboration with partners like the World Bank, but especially the IMF, that have really expanded their technical assistance on gender budgeting. So I think I will stop there and stop sharing my screen. And I hope that was was clear and useful for everyone. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Zohra. This is really, really impressive work. And actually, this is just I'm getting ahead of myself. This is the reason why we are going to meet in person this workshop in fall on University of Arizona campus. And I was right in my anticipation that we needed 10 hours to discuss it at least. So anyway, with that, so this is really, really amazing. So with that, now I welcome Jane Bambauer. Jane Bambauer is a professor of law at University of Arizona. And she is also the deputy co-director of Center for Quantum Computing, Quantum Network, which is one of the kind of research center financed by National Science Foundation. Jane I am a little bit biased because Jane is my co-author and friend, but she is one of the leading legal scholar in the country today we have. She through a variety of work, particularly on the importance of social cost and benefit of big data and interaction between technology, free speech and privacy and competitive markets, she has been beyond her amazing line of legal scholarship. She has been trying to help US government to navigate the balance between privacy and utilization of technology. She is one of the most visible legal scholar. She often appears in Washington Post, New York Times, Fox News, and Lawfare. Jane has a bachelor in mathematics from Yale University and JD from Yale Law School. So Jane, what I will do is that we are running out of time, but I want to give you enough time, but I promise everyone that we will have time for some question and answer. But so Jane, if you can tailor your discussion about the limits of law. So with
I will. Yeah, so my remarks will probably be more provocative than I intended them to, only because in the interest of time, I'm going to get straight to the areas where that raise questions about the approach to increasing economic participation for women, and sort of skim over the things on which I suspect we all agree, but I can't wait until the fall when I get to meet everyone. So first I want to just start, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the story about lawyers, female lawyers in the US. And so one question is like, why, given that we're looking at a sort of global development context, why should we look at these skilled elites in one country that's doing relatively well, not the best case scenario, but it's doing quite well, even on the index that Alena and Marie presented. And I think it's instructive to look at something that's close to the best case scenario because there are still persistent gaps. And so that means, and by the way, the story I'm going to show is that they're not entirely attributable to workplace discrimination. And so that raises interesting questions about how to close the gap once you're kind of getting close, right? So here's, I'm going to skip the overview. So what got me interested in this question was looking at professionals, not only female JD holders, those are lawyers, but other advanced degrees as well, in some census data, and noticing that women were quite underemployed. So especially in the years when women should really be building their careers and becoming, getting a partner, or in any case, really solidifying the particular the craft of their particular career that they want, about 30% of women were not working even 20 hours per week. And this is true. And by the way, the male comparison is, almost no underemployment. This is true also of medical degree holders and MBA holders as well. So they're all hovering, just a little below 30%. So for me, this was shocking, being in this pool and, balancing on that rickety chair that Amy referenced. I thought a lot more of my peers were kind of still in the game of the balancing act than in fact there are. So by the way, this is true even if you look at the tippity top of the legal profession. So Harvard and University of Michigan, both very top law schools, they have some long running data collection, which is useful for us. And you can see here that, 15 years out of school, these Harvard grads, this was only one cohort, so less useful, but still 15 years out of school, 40% of women were either not working or were only working part-time, compared to 5% for men. Same with University of Michigan. Okay, so the usual theories are discrimination or self-selection and productivity gaps. So for sure, I just want to, there is abundant evidence that, even when you control for all the things that you're supposed to control for, there's still an unexplained gap in income or whatever variable, whatever outcome variable that we're looking at. It's also equally true that some of those things that we control for, like number of hours worked, and certain other, things that correlate with quality of work, do reduce that gap. I still would not necessarily, though, say that we know how we know the role of that discrimination versus self-selection plays, because the two can reinforce each other, and there's sort of a chicken and the egg problem. So, if discrimination precedes the productivity gap, if a woman entering her first job at a law firm, for example, is already suffering from discrimination, then she will probably work fewer hours, either because the culture is toxic or because she's just not getting as many hours, that sort of thing. And then the reverse is also true, that if a female law clerk is less productive, then there may be real or perceived instances of discrimination. And so Tauhidur and I are working on trying to disentangle this. We have a data set that's longitudinal that we think could help us look at whether discrimination at the moment of the first wave, when it's really too early to have true performance and productivity gaps, can explain some of the reduced productivity later. Anyway, but here's where culture has come up multiple times now as that, that the fish in water problem here. And I want to give one specific cultural account that kind of shows how difficult it is to reduce gaps. And first of all, even how in some contexts, the goal of completely reducing gaps and having completely equal labor force participation could itself, in some theories of feminism, be the wrong goal. Okay, so first of all, female elites, especially lawyers here is what we're most familiar with, they marry other high earners. And so females who start with a career strategy, who expect to be working their whole lives, full-time their whole lives, they actually have an option of switching to a traditional domestic role if they want to. or if they're compelled to, I should say. Male spouses, if a female, if a wife, and sorry to be heteronormative here, but the data, that's all we can really study at this point. If a wife does switch from a career path to a traditional path, there's good evidence that either male spouses feel like that they don't, they shouldn't or can't complain, or in fact, there's quite a bit of evidence that they are actively encouraging this, whether they're realize it or not. And these old, what are sometimes called old school views, are actually have increased a little over time. So next in the story, male spouses are not in the same position. So that's true for a couple reasons. First of all, oftentimes male spouses are married to somebody who does not earn as much income, whereas female spouses have a partner who earn as much or more than they do. So this is like this is a kind of distortion or new version of a two-income trap, that if you have two people who are both making high salaries, it means one can quit. And that's, that has some implications for the person who does quit. Okay, and so then if females do step out of their career temporarily, this, I think, is uncontroversial. It's extremely hard to go back, and it's hard to go back for reasons that could maybe be partly explained by, genuinely lacking keeping up, but more likely, there's just less of a will and less of an incentive for employers to take a second look at, or take a new look at women who have left the career full-time employment for a while and want to come back. Okay, so then the last thing, I think a lot of these are kind of well documented. And so then if you combine that with the fact that careers do involve bumps and uncertainty, and that's especially true of women because of that, their chair, everyone's chairs are a little bit wobbly, women's are more. Then you could wind up in this self-reinforcing cycle. And so that might, at least a paper that Tauhidur and I published, we find some circumstantial evidence that this story is holding up. And maybe with the post-COVID, we might have even better data. I'm going to skip this for a second. Okay, so finally to the big point. So what does that say about culture and law? Well, so the US is doing some things well that I'm sure appear, that do get counted in the index. We have anti-discrimination and sexual harassment laws, and they're pretty well enforced, relatively speaking. Some states have transparency laws, so they are keeping count of hiring and retention decisions and whatnot, and making those public, and that helps sort of shift corporate culture. We have some family leave protection. We have, of course, the FMLA, but also, corporations, at least large ones, are increasingly even paying, allowing paid family leave. On the other hand, there's a lot in US law that doesn't often get thought of as sort of clear gender-oriented lawmaking, but that winds up affecting this dynamic. So tax penalties, there's some pretty good evidence that even if people aren't consciously thinking about it, on some level, at least two-parent households are making decisions based on tax consequences. And we have a situation where, especially for higher incomes, the two-earner families are penalized for having both partners stay in. We have not, we have no real, outside of this pandemic for a very short period, we didn't have support for pre-K and for childcare. And we definitely don't have support for re-entry. And then family leave costs, this one, I'm curious whether any of this kind of gets worked into the World Bank work so far, but there are reasons to want to have family leave costs spread across the entire public rather than just to employers. I mean, especially, in the US, nearly half of the jobs are at small businesses, and usually even when we're talking about compulsory family leave, paid family leave, The laws usually have an exception for small businesses, but even if they didn't, family leave that's paid for by the employer kind of winds up pitting females who want to take time off and get paid for it from their own peers at work. And so that sort of leaves an uncomfortable dynamic. So I think I'll leave it there, Tauhid, or rather, I guess I'll just say that the insights, to be more specific, the insights that Tauhid and my research on kind of the elite professions, the way that these might help the long-term goals of the World Bank, which, by the way, your work is fantastic. I learned so much today. But it suggests that over time, there may be useful revisions to the index, that there may be laws that should be added or should be modified. There may be weighting that over time we can learn ought to be reweighted. And then also there might be cultural milestones that wind up being as important, if not more important, than what the law is at any specific time. So I'll stop there, and thanks so much for inviting me. I'm definitely the odd man on this panel, but I loved every minute of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you for bringing your perspective. With this now, this is just, I am dumbfounded because of excitement. The kind of perspective and insights and food for thought that you have generated the panel. I will be personally subsisting on it for the rest of the summer at least. So with this, I'm going to open, even though we are late, so we will at least have 15 minutes time, even though we respect people, we have been doing for 2 hours, and open the question for 15-20 minutes Q&A. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand. So let me see, I can see everyone. So let's see.
Looks like Prashit.
So yes, Prashit, go ahead. Lauren, go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay, Prashit, go ahead.
Sorry. Can you
and
hear
be
me
precise.
Now?
Please ask questions directly. Be precise. We are running out of
So
time.
my question is to, first of all, thank you everyone. And my question is to our first speaker. I observed in the first slide number 7 or 8 somewhere, data from Cuba is missing. So I was just curious on that front. Cuba is doing very well in terms of health indicators. So is there any evidence from other sources if that country is also doing better or worse on this WL index, or maybe on some similar, indicators? Thanks.
Should we take more questions, or should we take more questions? And Lauren, go ahead, and then you can combine it,
So my question is kind of for everyone on the panel. I noticed a lot of focus on the law, and then Jane brought up about like outside of the law, and I was curious if there was any opening for a nonprofit or non-governmental group to create like a branding, like for organic, but for like a company that creates like either that checks their supply chains to make sure that they promote egalitarian wages and childcare, or within country, or something of that sort. Thank you, and thank you again for all the talks that were like really great. Thank you.
You want to address this, and then we will have more questions. Mari, you want to take it?
Yeah, sure, I can take it. So yeah, Cuba is not included in our data set. So it's missing from several World Bank Group data sets. So it's a country that we don't cover at present. We don't have information on. And yeah, I'm interested to hear about the legal landscape there in terms of gender equality, but it's not something that I know about. In relation to the kind of this idea of certification, it's something that we were thinking about recently in our team. We were talking about, there are certain there may be certain costs to firms to implementing some of the measures that we cover in the index when we're thinking about, like, incentives to encourage more gender affirming or gender equality behaviors. And I did some research into it, and I actually believe this is something that UN Women are working on, that there is a kind of a pilot project that's ongoing, I believe in the Latin America region, that has these certifications for private sector firms that have good policies in place. But beyond that, I don't know if this pilot is being expanded by the UN into other areas or other regions, but it's something that I think it's a very interesting idea. And I think that there's a lot of progress has been made in terms of like environmental progress, and these green certification programs. They seem to be quite effective. So it'll be interesting to see what could be done in the gender space.
So with that, I'm going to ask a series of questions, and the whole panel, I will request you to respond. It is free for everybody, so when jump in. So I have a series of questions. So the first to begin with, so if you look at general emerging consensus, that what explains persistence of gender inequality around the world, you will see that in Western countries, the nature of discrimination and the factors are very different from in developing countries. So not only the nature of discrimination or gender gap you have in poor countries, in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, and then you compare OECD countries. So because of that, one thing just I'm asking particularly for WBL team, is it worthwhile to consider to have a different kind of indicators to rank and monitor the progress of changes in law for developing countries from developed countries? Because what you are implicitly assuming that the constitution, rule of law, the institutions around the world has to be implicitly uniform. And therefore, you are comparing all these countries which are so heterogeneous. They have different history. Some of them have a legacy of colonialism. So they are so different all over the planet in terms of their historical trajectory. And now the idea of ranking them on uniform 18 or 35 indicators is somehow, I feel like you are enforcing without subconsciously a uniform yardstick that may be a disadvantage for many developing countries. So that is one thought I had. Secondly, about what predicts why some countries, as you were presenting, why some countries are adopting gender equality law than others. And in that context, so I was looking at your original paper. I was curious whether you thought about the role of, to what extent these countries rely on export. And those are, for example, openness. So we had in last 30 years, a big movement towards globalization and free trade. But if you look at 190 countries, there is a huge variation in degree of openness to their international trade and globalization. They are not equally integrated. So it is my hunch is that the countries which are more reliant on export for their GDP, the countries that receive more FDI from Western countries, they are more likely to bring these reforms than the countries which are not, because there is an incentive, there is an inbuilt requirement from these international funding institutions. So do that. So that may be one of the omitted variable bias. Now, related to this is something Amy brought up. I'm going through the list of questions which from your each presentation I got, and then you can respond, all of you. The other one is the role, the interaction between gender norms and the law. So for example, when we are thinking in terms of why some countries are doing better than other in terms of making progress, there is no doubt that there is a a strong interaction with gender norms. So the law itself can change the gender norms, and gender norms itself can perpetuate the laws that are gender inequitable. And is there something how to disentangle? And this is where Gates Foundation's work, particularly on girls' education, basic healthcare, that is very important. Related to what Zohra presented, Zohra, I had one specific question to you. This is really fascinating. I would like to look at your data particularly. I will be after you after this talk, is over. One is that how do you define gender equality projects? For example, let's say different countries, as I was saying, my first point, that different countries are at different stages of development, and some countries has been democratic for the last 300 years. Some countries became independent only 30, 40 years ago. So if you look at gender budgeting for gender empowerment programs, so if I'm looking at internationally, how do you reconcile what constitute gender equality projects? For example, let's say Nepal, Sierra Leone. Their basic fundamental barrier, the need is basic education, hygiene, sanitation, access to clean water. Now, do you consider all those budgets? That is where their priorities are, that they are gender equality projects, because by nature, they are gender neutral, basic education. So that was one question. The last one, which is, this is not a criticism, but this is something with Marie and Alena have thought about it, is that here we have been talking about, including what Jane was presenting, about the role of culture, and then US is so different that sometimes when we have international discourse and when we talk about gender inequality, people think about developing countries. And we do not think about in our home ground, that even in Western countries, and as Jane was highlighting, that among even highly skilled professionals, where the laws doesn't seem to be restrictive, there is a serious gap in gender outcomes. So that is where I think I totally agree with what Jane was saying in terms of revision of indicators along which you are ranking, to reflect countries like United States. But my last question was the following. This is for all of us, and including myself. Here we are focusing, Tia and I last week discussed in her office in Washington, DC, and is that following. We are focusing on adult women. Gender inequality, the overwhelming consensus is that gender inequality begins at the time of birth. By the time you are 21 years old, your mindset, your perception, your aspirations, male or female, things have been determined. And so what we are dealing with is that while our focus on formal sector and the role of law in formal sector is really important, but this is a small subset of women and a small aspect of gender inequality that we are talking about. Majority of countries, for example, in India, if you go to Bombay, Delhi, Madras, Chennai, big metropolitan cities, they are profoundly different from the part of India I come from. And it is not about even the law. If you go and ask people, what are the barriers to gender empowerment in rural areas? None of them will say that it is about the law. They will talk about issues such as unequal access to hygiene, healthcare, sanitation facility, road infrastructure, teachers, and all those kind of things. So yeah, so these were my questions, set of questions, and please, if you can, anyone can jump and address it.
So can I go quickly?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. So, just a couple of reflections, and I didn't get a chance to respond to, I think it was Lauren's question about the private sector, because that is indeed correct. UN Women has a whole program that looks at private companies. We have the WEPS principles, which is the Women's Empowerment Principles, which consists of seven principles. And I know you said do not use the chat, but if you could please put that in the chat, that would be great and save us a little bit of time.
Sure.
So I will put that in the chat after my intervention. But they do exactly what Lauren asked, right? So they look at women's representation, whether from the board all the way through to supply chains, and there's been a gender assessment of it. It's linked to the UN Global Compact, so it's part of something much bigger than just UN Women. It's a whole kind of UN system and making sure that companies have really human rights at the heart of their operations. So I think that's a really important instrument that speaks to some of the points that he was raising. I just want to, I know you've asked me a specific question about gender expenditures, and I'll try to respond to that in a minute, but just a couple of reflections on some of the other questions you raised. I mean, different standards for different countries. For us, then we don't have comparable data, right? Because if we're using different criteria for different countries, and we can't compare across the world what the state is. And it's incredibly important to have comparable data because it's not to punish countries or to say these countries are lagging behind or whatever, but it's really to then target, as an international organization, to target our technical assistance to countries as they need it. We never ever give generic technical assistance. I mean, the bank doesn't do that either, the IMF doesn't do that. It's always tailored technical assistance, it's granular technical assistance. So it's understanding what the context is, it's looking at what the needs are in countries, what the policy environment is, what the legal environment is, and so on. So I think, states have signed up to the SDGs. The SDGs are a universal framework. And if we have different standards for different countries, then we can't say where we're moving as a globe, as a world, as countries of the United Nations. So I think it would be incredibly challenging. But I work in an intergovernmental space, and I follow intergovernmental negotiations on financing for development. And I can tell you that in that space, some of the the smallest states are some of the most powerful, because it's all a game of engineering, right? It's who you partner with, how you mobilize others, how the groupings that you're part of, whether it's the G77 or the G20 or whatever. So I think in the UN, states do have an equal voice and can put to in the intergovernmental space, can put their concerns forward. And really our job as the supporting the UN system is really to understand where states are in terms of the development and how we can tailor that assistance. In terms of FDI, I mean, yes, I think that's correct. It's not untrue that that companies or donors, whatever, sometimes attach conditionalities. I'm of the view that I think when it comes to conditionalities for gender equality, I'm actually against those. I think that it undermines national ownership. And certainly the work that I do, and I've worked in Africa, in Asia, and Latin America, and so on, I think there are civil society organizations, women's groups, and so on, that want exactly the same thing women want in developed countries. They want decent jobs, they want to be free from violence, they want to be able to participate in economic, social, political life. And so we really need to make sure that states understand what their role is in terms of providing women with the kind of framework that they need in order to lead the kinds of lives that we all want to lead, right? Which are healthy, prosperous lives. And then just on your question specifically to me on gender projects, that's very challenging because you're right. In some countries, there might be priorities around, as you said, health or sanitation. In other countries, more advanced economy, it's around equal pay and so on, and taxation and looking at other areas. But I think every single country has gender priorities or gender objectives. And in most countries, they have national gender equality plans. So what we do as UN Women is support countries to implement their national gender equality plans. So we don't superimpose any kind of value system or any thing that we think countries should be doing, but rather what is set out in their plans, like what are their gender equality objectives as Sierra Leone or as Nepal. And incidentally, it's very interesting examples. I mean, maybe you chose them randomly, I don't know. But Nepal has a very good gender budgeting system. It has a tagging system and so on. But are they closer to achieving gender equality? Probably not, because there are a whole lot of other factors, including cultural, societal, and so on, that go into gender equality. And to your question about, some are gender neutral, nothing is gender neutral, nothing at all. Sanitation is certainly not gender neutral. Sanitation is in fact one of the most gendered things that I know, because we know that if girls and women don't have adequate sanitation, then we see things like girls dropping out of school when they've got their period. In advanced economies, we see things like pink taxes, where you go out to buy sanitary towels and they're much more expensive than things that similar types of products that men would use. And there's a lot of work now going on looking at pink taxes, especially around deodorants and shaving equipment and so on, because you see the discrimination in that. And in many countries, we know in Asia particularly, women are banished from the house when they're menstruating. That is utter discrimination. So, just to conclude then, I think that when we look at spending for gender equality, we start with the National Action Plan. What is the government prioritized in terms of spend? And then how do we support them in ensuring that they mobilize and have the resources available? And so that's the expenditure side, but also making sure that they're not, putting in place or instituting tax measures that can then be negative for women as well. So we're very interested in progressive taxation and looking at issues around VAT and so on and so forth. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Zohra. That's wonderful. Now, Mari and Alena, Jane, and Amy.
Go ahead, Alena.
Okay, so let me jump in and just reflect on a couple of points, Tauhid, that you mentioned. I think a lot of the questions that you raised come down to one, important thing. It's about the strength and the limitations of our study. What Zohra just mentioned, just having the comparable data is so challenging in the modern world, and we're covering 190 countries spanning 7 regions. So the question is how do you make the data comparable and the data collection feasible, particularly when it comes on an annual basis, right? So this is where, on the one hand, if we think about the strengths, the data that we collect on an annual basis is comparable, the data collection is feasible, it's manageable. But on the other hand, the study also comes with a set of limitations. And as you rightfully pointed out, there is a number of things, such as individual country context, the role of culture that are missing from what we do in WBL, because of the standardized set of assumptions that we typically apply to a woman who is 25 years of age, working in a grocery store in the retail sector, making the minimum wage. But we focus on the most populous group. We also look in those economies that are federal states. We look at the laws and regulations that are largely applicable to the main business city. And with all these limitations, we understand that even the focus on the most populous groups, we are missing out on a lot of nuances that are, very specific in certain country contexts. So I guess this is one of the main limitations of the study, but nonetheless, we do provide the comparable and transparent data that is feasible to collect on an annual basis. And in terms of, just to reflect on, that Jane raised a very important question, if there is a possibility of the revision of the index going forward. This is something that the team broadly works on doing right now. And as we mentioned in our presentation, we're expanding into the new areas of research that could be largely missing at this stage. The COVID-19 has amplified the importance of the childcare crisis. So we're looking towards exploring regulatory frameworks around the provision of available, affordable, and quality childcare services. One of the most important limitations, so we're trying to complement the assessment of just legal frameworks with the implementation component. This work is ongoing, and what you have seen in the report is just a small part of it. So in the next years, it might not come in the next year's report, but in the year after, we plan to come back with a fully fleshed out, index or indicators around the implementation of laws. So each one of the 35 questions that we're currently covering in the legal database will be complemented with a corresponding question on the implementation side. So this is where we're employing this, the structure, process, outcome type of conceptual approach where we're trying to see what instruments are out there across a large subset of economies that government put in place in order to address the issue of the implementation. Partly it covers social and cultural norms, but social and cultural norms has always been something that largely is outside of the women, business, and the law scope of methodology and measurement approach, because this is typically something that could be best addressed by the household level surveys, which we don't do. We do the cross-country, data collection and coverage, but this is we do acknowledge that this is extremely important. And there is a vast body of research that also shows that the legal reform can actually serve as a magnet and exert the change in the social norms. And so this is something that we're also trying to promote through a series of case studies that we're doing and exploring, potential drivers of reforms in the country. And in terms of changing the index, this is the plan. Maybe not this year, but the next year we do plan to, expand in other areas. Like some of the ongoing research also includes looking at frameworks affecting women with disabilities. So this is something that the intersectional modalities of this research is something that we're also currently covering. Stay tuned for more, and changes will happen to the index. Definitely, we will also consider a very good comment in terms of an adult woman. The reason why we're covering, an adult woman is because we are trying to see what is applicable to a woman at the stage when she is already capable of making economic decisions of her own. And we do understand that a lot of this, the big chunk of population is largely missing, and that includes the early childhood, that includes the areas that we used to cover before, such as the child marriage. We're also in discussion of potentially bringing those areas back, because we do recognize the limitations and the importance of, like early childhood coverage, as well as educational outcomes and things like this. So let me stop right there and turn it to Jane, as she was also about to say something.
Yeah, well, I just, your last question, Tauhid, really resonated with me because the kind of cultural forces that I gravitate towards are the ones that are in the home. So and so the home is where the childhood starts, right? So the essence of your question is, by the time we're looking at adults, the child has already been inculcated by whatever has happened in their family, and to a somewhat lesser degree in their primary education. And so, on one hand, I do think that anything that serves adult women well should feed back into the home anyways. And there's some evidence that, especially when you look at the mother's role in the family, and the education and the economic outcome of the mother is one of the best predictors of how the children are going to what they're going to prioritize and what they'll wind up doing. And so that's a good sign in itself. That's probably enough of a justification, I think, for focusing on women. But the other thing, I guess, that the other pickle, I guess, that to all of this research is that it's possible that even if we had kind of an optimal, whatever that means, like a perfect culture when raising children, there may still be kind of differences in the distributions, so women and men as adults, even if they're completely equally agentic, may have different goals. And I think one kind of latent question that economists at least are not asking very much is what to do with that in terms of policy, or like whether we should feel good or bad about that. And I just want to make a pitch for being in favor of work and finding policies that that encourage women to become financially independent, even if it's not strictly necessary, or even, kind of, their sort of individual preference. And one reason for that is that at the society level, we need more women in the boardrooms and in politics. And so, the stakes are high enough that I think that encouraging agency, but also a culture that rewards and encourages people to stick to high status careers is going to be very important.
So this is thank you for everyone for feedback. One thing, so I agree with all of your response. So one thought is, this is without getting too technical. My question about I totally appreciate the importance of having comparable international indicators. And this is always a challenge when you have international comparison, it applies to income, purchasing power parity. That's why we have. So there is, what I was getting at is, how do you weight? My question was, how do you aggregate different indicators? So for example, let's say, if you look at, assume that you have 35 indicators of WBL index, some indicators are more relevant, critical for some countries than other countries. Now, so if you are, so it is not about just the choice of indicators, right? Which is, you need to have uniform, but also how do you aggregate them? Which indicator gets more weight? That is where you can think of, I'm sure you think within the World Bank and even UN Women, the kind of index you are calculating, Zohra, is that it is not just about the choice of indicators, but also how do you assign weights. In certain countries, some of the laws, if they are missing, they are more impactful and more critical, more adverse consequences, while other indicators might not be as critical as binding. So it is about aggregate weighting. And then the last thought, and with that we will conclude, already we have taken more than 2.5 hours, is this. I really love what WBL team and UN Women and Gates Foundation has been doing. But particularly, it should not surprise you that for the last 10 years, this is what I have been breathing and thinking, at least pretending to be in this space to make some meaningful contribution on issues of women's agency and empowerment, and through a variety of projects. Last thing I had, so the WBL index, what it has done is that it has put the issue at the international policy discourse, and it has mainstreamed it. Now that we are debating it, and people are talking about it, there is a regional competition about it. So this has anchored among the policy corridors, which is I think where your biggest impact is. Going forward, one thing beyond many, among other things, one thing I would, perhaps you may think, is that why can you think of an outcome indicator? So for example, each indicator of law that you think, this is a kind of input variable, right? Now let's say a particular law passes. How do you know that indicator is successful? So do you have a corresponding output indicator, and for which you collect the data? So what I'm saying is that for each legal indicator, you have, okay, if this is implemented, you highlighted that in passing the law doesn't mean implementation. But if it is implemented, what outcomes do you expect to happen? And so can you, to some extent, collect a data on the outcome indicators, and that is where you do the ranking. Any discrepancy between the two shows the extent of lack of implementation and our regional variation around it. So with this I will stop here. Thank you very much for everyone for this wonderful discussion. And it is really a lot of food for thought. And this is the end of our semester. And I will coordinate with you. I promise you, I will not leave you alone. we will have this workshop in person in fall, and it will be 2-day event. So thank you everyone and have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having us. Take care. Bye.
Thank you so much.